So today I want to talk about what money can buy, what money can't buy, and how we should think about the role of money in open source. You've probably heard people talk about underfunded projects in open source. But for starters, let's try to imagine the impossible. You're a project with a lot of money to spend, maybe through grants or through donations. How do you spend all that money? I think it's an important question to ask, because if we can't answer this question, why bother talking about money in open source at all? Why bother asking for donations or contracts or sponsorships? And so that's what I want to talk about today. How should we think about the role of money in an open source ecosystem? So money has historically had a contentious relationship with open source. On the one hand, you hear people talking about underfunded projects. And on the other hand, you hear people saying, money ruins everything and we shouldn't pay for anything at all. Both of these things have some truth to them. And that's partly because there are different incentives that drive open source contributions. So if we're going to answer this question of how do we spend money in open source, we have to start by asking, why do people contribute to open source in the first place? Turns out, people contribute to open source for a lot of reasons. I'm going to go through a couple that might sound familiar to you. The first is wanting to solve a problem. This is a true intrinsic motivation, and it's especially relevant in the earliest stages of an open source project. So your first contribution, or when you first open source a project, these things often happen because someone wanted to solve their own problem. For casual contributions, this is by far the most common reason, and these one-time contributions make up nearly half of all contributors to top projects on GitHub. Second is reputation-based. So if that first-time contributor keeps coming back, they might find that reputation becomes a good reason for sticking around. Whether we like it or not, open source has become a public resume of sorts. And some people find that contributing to open source helps improve their hireability or their earning power. Third one is community. For regular and longer-term contributors, another reason why they stick around is because they feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. Sometimes finding the right open source project feels like finding your community. And finally, some people contribute once, twice, or for many years, just because they think it's fun. Open source can be a welcome distraction from work or from day-to-day life. And so these are some of the most common reasons that I've seen why people contribute to open source. But another thing to consider is that these incentives can change over time. And so you might actually resonate with this. If we think about the process of going from using a project for the first time to making your first contribution, to contributing regularly or even maintaining a project, it seems obvious that the reasons why you stay there might change over time. So while someone might contribute to the first time because they want to solve their own problem, maybe the community is why they end up sticking around. And I swear I wrote this part of my talk before I learned that there's this famous quote going around from Brett Cannon about he came for the language and he stayed for the community. Apparently it's made into 2 other keynotes, so I'm going to make it a 3rd. But that's a textbook example of what I'm talking about here, coming for the language, staying for the community. Thank you, Brett, for being my example. Anyway, so this is especially interesting for a maintainer because reputational benefit maxes out over time. So it might have been really beneficial to be known as a project maintainer early on, but at some point, even if you step down, you'll probably still be known for having maintained that project. So you'll need another reason to stick around. And so recognizing this is important. If we want to spend money smartly in open source, we need to start by meeting people where they're at. The thing is, where they're at is often fine. A lot of these incentives are actually working pretty well, and that's a really good thing. So for example, a first-time contributor doesn't really need a financial incentive to make that contribution. They might need help figuring out how to make a contribution, but that's different than giving them motivation. That's more about reducing friction. And so instead of replacing people's motivations, we should think about using money to help people do what they already feel motivated to do. If we're talking about that person who wants to make a first-time contribution, they might be intimidated and they don't know how. So you can use money to host a workshop that would make that experience more welcoming. So back to our hypothetical open source project with way too much money to spend. Now that we understand contributor incentives a little bit better, how should that project think about spending money? I'm going to go through different stages of an open source project and talk about the role that money can play throughout. So first we have creating the project, and then we have finding users, And then it's about turning those users into contributors. And finally, the longer-term maintenance aspects of a project. So firstly, we have to create a project, right? Which you can think of as a project's startup costs. And I put creation in the beginning, but creation obviously happens throughout the life of a project with major new features and improvements. These new ideas tend to come from intrinsic motivations, like wanting to solve an interesting problem. The difference is they can take a lot of time to implement all in one go. While this work can be done without any funding at all, funding someone to spend dedicated time on a problem makes a solution more likely to happen. Example of how funding helps people create comes from the origin story of PostGIS, which is spatial mapping software. Paul Ramsey, who's a maintainer of PostGIS, notes that while they did create the first prototype for free, it was actually another interested person who got government funding that led to the first release. This is an example of the hidden role that funding can play, because Paul notes that most people don't know this is the actual story. Splash example of this is Font Awesome, which ran what I believe is the biggest software Kickstarter campaign to date. Font Awesome has been around for a while, but they recently wanted to make major updates and improvements, so they crowdfunded just over $1 million for that purpose. So now that we made a project, we have to find people to use it. At this stage, people are likely to be motivated by a sense of community, so you can use money to empower other people to spread the word. So sponsoring community events like meetups, conference travel, swag, all that stuff can help expose more people to a project. And since a lot of new contributors start out as users, expanding your total number of users also helps you expand the potential group of contributors. Great example of this are these challenge coins from a project called Beware. They gave these coins away to people who contributed to the project at a conference, and it turned out to be pretty good advertising. To help fund the coins' creation, Beware asked a couple of companies to sponsor them. So now we've got users, it's about converting those users into first-time contributors. As we've learned, most first-time contributors already want to contribute for their own reasons. So this is more about paying for things that make it easier for them to do so. That's stuff like in-person sprints, workshops, maintainer meetups. Recent example of this is from GopherCon earlier this year. And so Jess Frizzell, who's on the Go team, noted that they had this contributor workshop, and from there she learned, the feedback they got was that, I learned how approachable the Go team is. Someone else responded saying, yes, having never met any of these people before, they made contributing feel significantly less scary. So final stage is maintaining. Once we move into long-term maintenance, spending money becomes a little bit trickier. And so if paying for creation is like paying for startup costs, you can think of maintaining as the overhead costs of a project. It takes time to review other people's contributions, answer people's questions, and just generally keep the project together. But it's not quite as easy as just paying every maintainer because of, again, these personal motivations. People maintain projects for different reasons. Some people enjoy open source as a hobby. Other people want to maintain a project for full-time work. Both of these things can be true. It's just about understanding that person and their individual needs before throwing money at them. I'll also add that for the creation and the maintenance stages, there's also more indirect ways to fund this kind of work, like asking your employer for dedicated time to work on a project. Example of this comes from Eran Hammer, who uses Patreon to fund his maintenance work on Happy.js. And as he points out, Happy community is actually doing quite well. He says that there are a lot of community members who contribute their time and their resources, but that's different from the maintenance work of Happy, which in his mind is things like reading every issue, reviewing all pull requests and commits, answering complex questions. And so the community contributions are separate from that kind of maintenance work. And when we talk about underfunded projects, what we're usually talking about are paying for these kinds of overhead costs. One of my favorite analogies for this comes from the nonprofit sector. You have plenty of people who volunteer their time at a nonprofit for altruistic reasons. Let's say picking up trash or spending time in an animal shelter. That base of volunteers doesn't need a financial incentive to contribute. In fact, some of them might be insulted if you tried to pay them. On the other hand, most nonprofits still need paid staff, right? Because someone needs to coordinate all those volunteers. And when you're spending endless hours on that kind of overhead work, altruism is probably not going to keep you there. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that projects have different roles with different kinds of incentives, and money can help support them. It's about using money to introduce it to the right person at the right time. One thing I hope you'll take away from this is that money doesn't replace community contributions. Projects still need engaged contributors and welcoming communities to keep them alive. At the same time, money equals resources. And when you have resources, you can use that to reduce friction and help people do the things that they already feel motivated to do. That's all I got. Thanks.